Is David Nilsen. I'm a full-time freelance food and beverage writer and educator, primarily focused upon craft chocolate and craft beer. And this is From Bean-to-Barstool and Back, collaboration and commonality between chocolate, beer, and spirits. We're going to be looking this morning at the overlaps and intersections between craft chocolate and the craft beverage industries. So craft beer, artisan distilleries, small wineries, things of that nature. Looking at those intersections both commercially and creatively. Our primary focus during this talk is going to be on the chocolate side of that, since this is a chocolate festival. But we will talk a little bit about the inverse of that as well and look at some beverage producers that are working with chocolate or chocolate ingredients to make some really cool drinks. We're going to start out looking at what these different worlds have in common, just creatively and culturally, and then we'll spend most of our time looking at examples from the craft chocolate space of chocolate makers who are working with artisan beverages or the ingredients that go into those beverages to make really unique bars. Then look at some of those drinks, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. The primary focus here is not going to be real technical. I want mostly for this to just sort of pique your curiosity to check out some interesting chocolates. We are set up in the 201 building over here, the old bank building. And we do have a few chocolates that I'm going to be talking about that we have for sale there, but the great thing about chocolate is that you can order it and have it shipped to you. Working in beverage alcohol, that is obviously not always the case for me, so with chocolate, you can just go on chocolate makers' websites and order all these amazing bars that we're going to talk about. So we got a lot to get into, so we can jump right in. So I started out originally working in craft beer as a freelance writer close to a decade ago, writing for a bunch of publications and leading tastings and that sort of thing. And I had an ongoing pairing series with a bar and restaurant in my town where every month we would pick a different type of food and do a beer pairing with it. So different national food traditions, Germany, Mexico, or cheese, desserts, different things like that. And one month, the owner wanted me to do a chocolate pairing. And I very naively thought, how complicated can chocolate really be? Fortunately, I reached out to a chocolate educator who dispossessed me of that naivety very, very quickly. She's actually here, London Co. She owns a company called Peace on Fifth. She's set up in the same building I am. She was my initial education into craft chocolate about 7 or 8 years ago. And she kind of opened up the world of craft chocolate to me and helped me realize that this was as diverse and just really cool of a world as the beverages that I had been working with before that. From there, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole and started learning as much as I could about craft chocolate. Picked up a book by a now friend of mine named Megan Giller. She has a book called Bean-to-Bar Chocolate that's just sort of a general primer on craft chocolate. And what really struck me as I was reading through that book was how many things craft chocolate had in common with craft beer and the beverages that I was used to working with. So many things culturally, the ways that makers were working with unique ingredients and creating new flavor combinations, even some things behind the scenes like the debates and arguments that makers have around how to define different things, like what is craft chocolate or what is bean-to-bar chocolate, was very similar to what I was seeing in the craft beer space of what counts as craft beer and that sort of thing. And then as I started looking more, I started finding that you could pair these beverages with craft chocolate, and craft chocolate makers were collaborating with beverage producers and craft breweries to make beers and chocolate bars and all these different things with each of them. And from there, I just started building parallel careers in craft chocolate and craft beer. And what I discovered for myself in following both of those kind of parallel to each other was that beyond just learning more about a new field in craft chocolate, looking at both of those things side by side actually deepened my interest in both of them because it allowed me a different lens to look at the things that I was already familiar with. So looking at beer through the lens of craft chocolate, helped me understand things about this industry that I was already working in at the time and kind of deepen my understanding of all of those. So what we're going to look at here in just a little bit is some of these examples of chocolate makers who have reached out to craft breweries or local distilleries or wineries and worked with them to create flavor possibilities in craft chocolate that most people are not expecting to find there. Chocolate obviously is awesome on its own. There's really cool single origin chocolate and very familiar flavors that are delicious. But by incorporating this different artisan world, you're able to get a whole new angle, not only on understanding the chocolate, but on the flavors that are possible through that. So I want to jump in and look at some of these individual examples. There are hundreds and hundreds of different examples of chocolate bars that are made with artisan beverages. We're going to look at initially here some breakdowns of chocolate bars by different types. So this is just my own research on bars that I have been able to find made with different drink varieties. You can see whiskey and craft beer are by far the highest number. This is by no means a complete survey of what is out there. This is just from my own tracking of this information and then recently looking through some offerings from different makers. The whiskey and beer is not too hard to explain on why those are the most popular. On the beer side, that largely comes down to variety. One of the great things that craft beer has to offer, separate from some of these other drink segments, is just sheer variety. There are so many different types of beer that are completely different from each other. And there are so many breweries in the United States, close to 10,000 craft breweries now. So that availability and that variety is an easy outreach for chocolate makers to work with just a local brewery to come up with all sorts of different flavors. The whiskey largely comes down to flavor compatibility between those spirits and chocolate. Most of the flavor that you get from something like bourbon or similar type of whiskey is largely coming from the oak barrels that the spirit is aged in, not from the base spirit itself. And that oak is going to give off flavors like vanilla, coconut, potentially baking spices like cinnamon or something closely related, caramel. All of those are obviously very easy, natural combinations with chocolate, so it's not a big reach to work with whiskey and have that be a pretty familiar but still surprising flavor combination. We get a good number with wine and rum. Wine is actually, even though we do a lot of wine and chocolate pairings, wine is a surprisingly difficult flavor to get to work with chocolate. It absolutely can work, but the acidity in wine can sometimes make that a little bit difficult, so we don't see quite as many of those. Rum is a pretty natural one. These other ones that don't have as many in them, gin and agave-based drinks like tequila, mezcal, sotol, even though those don't have a lot in numbers, we do see those represented pretty well regionally in particular places where those drinks are popular. So there's a number of Mexican craft chocolate makers that will make bars with mezcal or a closely related agave drink. So even though there aren't a ton of them here, they are popular in areas where those beverages are popular. Quite a few Scandinavian makers who make some things with gin. We'll get to a few of those examples as well. So let's go ahead and look at how chocolate makers are using these beverages, because there's a big challenge when you're trying to get the flavors of a beverage into chocolate. You can't use liquids in the chocolate making process, and that makes a tremendous challenge. So when you're making chocolate, if you're not familiar with the process, you start with these dried cacao beans. Those get roasted, then they get cracked and winnowed to separate them from the husk that's around the bean, and you end up with these broken up pieces of the beans called cacao nibs. Those get put into basically a continuous grinding machine that grinds those up. About 50% of the bean is fat and about 50% is solids. When it gets ground up, the friction liquefies that fat and then breaks the solids down into smaller pieces. So you end up with sort of like a chocolate syrup. We call it chocolate liquor. And that gets ground up for hours and hours and hours until it's very, very smooth, and then you can make that into chocolate from there. Despite the fact that it is a liquid, there's not actually any moisture in that liquid. All of it is liquefied fat. If you get any moisture into that liquefied chocolate, it will do what's called seizing. It'll separate out physically, and you'll end up with these like sticky, gooey clumps of cacao. And from there, you either got to throw it out or catch the problem very, very quickly and take some steps to fix it. But you can't introduce any liquid to that chocolate at that point, or that will happen and the process is over. So if you're going to get the flavors of all of these types of drinks into your chocolate, you have to be pretty creative with how you're going to be able to combine those together. So let's look at some different examples of how that is done. The most common, by far the most popular way that this is done is by soaking the cacao nibs in whatever beverage you're going to use. So after you've gone through that initial process of roasting, cracking, and winnowing, and now you've just got these cacao nibs, you can take them and just infuse them basically. Soak them in beer, whiskey, whatever it is you're going to use. Allow it to sit for anywhere from a few hours to usually several days. Then take it off of that liquid, dry it out completely. It's sort of saturated with the flavors, but you want all the liquid itself gone, dry it out, then you can continue on with the chocolate making process as normal. This is by far the most popular, so there are a ton of examples of these. This is just a few that I put up here. Chances are, if you find a craft chocolate bar with some kind of alcoholic beverage and it doesn't say how it was made, this is probably what they're doing. It's sort of the standard. So I'll run through a couple different examples here with all sorts of different beverages. That far one down there is from Chocolate Conspiracy. They are out of Salt Lake City, Utah. And the owner of that company is a huge craft beer fan. So he works with about half a dozen different breweries around Salt Lake City to make his bars. So he uses this technique, soaks his nibs in whatever beer it is he's using, and then I know it's kind of small to see, but he will use the branding of whatever the beer was in partnership with that brewery on the bar. So that particular bar right there is called Black Lager. That's using a beer called Baba Black Lager, hence the sheep, from Uinta Brewing, and they will co-label those basically so that they resemble each other. That one is available on their website and is one of their best-selling bars, but he'll do some small batch ones with breweries, sometimes to where the bar is only available at that brewery as a way to kind of incentivize people going and checking them out. Last time I spoke with him, he was working on trying to develop basically a chocolate six-pack that would be all different Salt Lake City beers, but it was all chocolate bars. So pretty cool idea there. The next one there, Baiani Caipirinha, that is from Brazil, and that is emulating the flavors of a caipirinha cocktail, very popular in Brazil. Caipirinha is made with a sugarcane-based spirit called cachaça. It's very similar to like a grassy white rum, and they soak the nibs in the cachaça. Caipirinha also has lime in it, so they dust the back of the bar with dried lime peel, and then the nibs are soaked in the cachaça. So when you taste it, you have that kind of spirituous, grassy flavor from the cachaça, but then you've got that little bit of dried citrus from the lime as well. They work extensively with Brazilian flavors to kind of represent where they're from, so that's a really fun one. Good Now Farms is up in Massachusetts, not too far from Boston, and they have a series of bars that they do with Boston Harbor Distillery right on the water there on the harbor. This one is with their rye whiskey. They also do one with a rum, and they do a seasonal one every October with their Demon Seed whiskey, which is a rye whiskey that has scorpion pepper and fresh ginger in it. So in all three examples, they do the same thing, soak the nibs, dry it out. And it's really fun to taste those side by side because you've got the house character of whatever base chocolate they're using, and you can really tell the difference then between each of the spirits when you're tasting them in the bar. A lot of places will use sort of a neutral blend of cacaos when they're working with spirits so that the chocolate is not getting in the way of the accent flavors from the drink. So Chocolate Conspiracy would be an example of that. Good Now Farms goes the other direction. Anytime they are doing any kind of inclusion bar, whether it's alcohol or coffee or berries, whatever it is they want to use, they specifically select a single origin of cacao to combine with that flavor so that those are kind of highlighting each other. So they pick different cacaos for each of those bars. I mentioned gin was popular from Scandinavian makers. Fiak is a Norwegian maker, and they work with a local distillery to use their Nine Sisters gin to get those flavors in there. This one is fascinating, and I wish I had this one on site at my booth because I'm pretty sure it would have sold out. This one is from Ritual Chocolate, another Utah maker, actually. This is their Après bar. And they make this with sparkling white wine, soak the nibs in sparkling white wine, and then put freeze-dried raspberries on the back, and it is just such an elegant flavor. White wine in chocolate does not infuse a ton of flavor in the way that a stronger spirit would. So you just get this very delicate white wine flavor, and then the berries kind of pull out a little bit of the fruitiness from that wine, but really, really elegant. Very, very graceful bar. There are tons of other examples of this. Like I said, this is the most popular technique. One thing as we're going through these different examples of different ways that makers will work with these drinks, there are combinations as well, where a maker might use more than one of these options to come up with different drinks. But any kind of alcoholic beverage that you are interested in finding in chocolate, some maker is using it with this process of soaking it in nibs because it's the most straightforward and easy way to infuse that. I find that it is most successful, this technique, with the stronger spirits, so the whiskeys and rums, actually distilled spirits, because they have enough punch to them that they really come through in the finished bar. Something like the beer bars, like that Chocolate Conspiracy, I've got that one for sale down at my booth. It's a beautiful bar, but the beer is a little bit more subtle. They're using a dark beer, which is already going to have a little bit of a chocolatey character to it. So it's not really standing out from the base chocolate as much as providing some kind of supporting complexity to that. So it doesn't kind of sit out on its own as much as you would get with the spirits. Another popular technique is barrel aging the nibs. So in this case, you're not using any liquid in any way. They're taking emptied spirit barrels that have dried out so they don't have any liquid still sitting in them, and then putting the nibs in there and allowing them to infuse, basically to collect the aroma from those barrels. Like I said, 50% or so of a cacao bean is fat. Fat is very, very absorbent of aromas. If you've ever left cheese out in your fridge and then it absorbed the smells of the other foods that were in your fridge, that's because that fat just absorbs that aroma so well. So when the nibs are sitting in the barrel, even though they never come in contact with the spirit itself, they end up getting kind of saturated with that aroma. Most of our perception of flavor is actually coming from our sense of smell. Even when we're eating things, we're getting a aroma from retronasal olfaction through the back of our respiratory system there, going up to our olfactory bulb in the brain. So most of our perception of flavor is coming from our sense of smell. So just being infused with those aromas gives them that full flavor. There's a lot of examples of this. I gave another one from Ritual, who did the Après bar on the last slide. They're out in Utah. They do that with a local distillery using their bourbon barrels. Cleveland Chocolate out of Ohio uses a local distillery on their whiskey barrels. And then Violet Sky is a really cool one. This is an Indiana maker. They're from South Bend. And the owner of Violet Sky loves kind of everything craft food and beverage, just does a little bit of everything. He makes sourdough bread, he roasts coffee, they have a whole cafe, and he works with breweries and distilleries, and I think he sometimes lets his curiosity just kind of steer him wherever he goes, and he falls down different trails with that. But he's worked with a number of different distilleries to barrel age different bars. Journeyman is out of Three Oaks, Michigan, and then also has another location in Valparaiso, Indiana, not far from him. So he's worked with several different spirits from them to barrel age the nibs. He ran into a problem at one point when the barrels were not dry enough. He put the nibs in there and they ended up molding because he left them in too long and they got wet. So he's learned to fine tune that process to make sure that the nibs stay fresh. Worked with a liquor store, a very popular liquor store on this middle bar to select a barrel with them to age those. And you'll see that he actually selects specific origins to match with each of those. This Guatemala origin is very bright and fruity, so it works really well with the botanical notes in that gin barrel. And then he picks a little bit richer origins for some of those darker spirits, so really fine-tunes those in interesting ways. We don't see this used as much on the beer side. It does get used occasionally for barrel-aged beers, but the majority of beer never sees wood. It completes the entire brewing process in stainless steel. But there are a few makers who have worked with breweries to use second-use barrels after they have barrel-aged a stronger beer. There's a maker out of Chicago called Sleepwalk Chocolate. They are a chocolate company run by Dark Matter Coffee. They worked with Revolution Brewing out of Chicago to use the barrels that they barrel-aged one of their imperial stouts in. But there aren't too many examples on the beer side. Another way that we see this done, and this is most common with beer bars in particular, is using actual ingredients that are used in the production of the beer in the bars themselves. And I find that this is my favorite way that makers will actually use beer itself. Like I mentioned earlier with the one bar from Chocolate Conspiracy, it's a really beautiful bar, but because the beer has pretty chocolatey flavors to begin with, it's a more subtle influence. So the bar itself is really good, but if you're looking for those beer flavors, it's not going to jump out in the open quite as much. In this case, a lot of makers are working with the ingredients that are used in beer and kind of highlighting those. So that far one down there, the malted milk one, is from French Broad Chocolate out of Asheville, North Carolina. On a side note, they recently were able to reopen after Hurricane Helene came through. They flooded when that came through, but they were, fortunately their warehouse where they stored all their chocolate was safe. It was just the production facility that got water damage, but they seem to be back on their feet now. That particular bar is made with malt powder. So they work with Riverbend Malt, which is a craft maltster in Asheville that provides malt for a lot of craft breweries in the area. Asheville is kind of a hotbed for craft beer. There's dozens and dozens of breweries, even though it's a fairly small city, and they provide malt for most of them. So French Broad reached out to them, got one of their most popular malts, had it ground into powder, and then put into the bar. Very familiar flavors in that. If you've ever had malted milk balls like Whopper candies or malt milkshakes, just kind of a gentle sweetness, but that is actually their best-selling bar. And they don't go out of the way to highlight the beer connection on that, I think to avoid turning off anyone who isn't particularly looking for that. If you tasted it and didn't know, you wouldn't think beer so much, but if you're familiar with the flavor of malt, you would recognize those flavors. They also, on the other side of those collaborations, provide cacao nibs for dozens of breweries around that area. I had the opportunity actually two years ago, November, to go down and do a 2-day festival with them. One night doing a pairing with different breweries, and then at their factory, we had a little mini fest where we brought in brewers from Asheville that had all made beers with their nibs. So you could go around and taste all these different beers made with their chocolate. The one next to that, actually, let's jump over here to this one from Omnam. So this one is an Iceland maker out of Reykjavik, right on the water. And this bar is made with brewing malts, but rather than using the powder like French Broad does, they actually use like cracked up pieces of the malt. I don't know how familiar any of you are with brewing ingredients. They're using a malt called Carafa 3. What's unique about that malt, it's out of Germany, is that it is roasted dark, like a lot of the malts that you would find in porters and stouts, but it is debittered. So it has chocolatey coffee flavors, but without that intense roast. If you've ever had like a really strong stout that has that intense roast. So that is not present in there. You get more of like a dark almost burnt caramel flavor, but it's a fairly sweet bar, so it kind of tempers some of those slightly burnt notes to it. It is, what's really interesting with this, I like to use this one in tastings and pairings and not tell people this till after they've had it. It is jet black, but it's actually white chocolate. They use activated charcoal to make it really, really dark because they want it to resemble the black volcanic sand on their beaches, but it's a white chocolate. And with people not knowing it's white chocolate, if they have any misconceptions or prejudices against white chocolate, they love the bar, and then I tell them afterwards it was white chocolate. But those two bars in the middle are both made with hops in two completely different methods. If you're not familiar, hops are the primary seasoning in beers. It's a small flower that can provide either bitterness or a wide range of flavors and aromas depending on how you use it in the brewing process and which types of hops you use. This one from Ratza Chocolate out of the Tampa area in Florida, she is a certified herbalist, and so she makes a bunch of different bars using different botanicals and herbs. And she uses hops in that bar and basically treats them like she would any other herb or botanical, and puts, she grinds up and actually puts the hop matter directly into the bar. It is a fairly aggressive bar. Like I mentioned, beer or hops can provide bitterness in beer. So when you're tasting that one, you get some of that sort of green, planty bitterness from the hops itself. And then she also adds, I believe it is orange peel in that bar to kind of pull out a little bit more of that citrusy character that you would typically get from some hop varieties. Going a completely different direction, Nostalgia Chocolate next to it, he was out of the Syracuse, New York area, and then very recently moved down to North Carolina. That bar does not actually use hops in it at all. He ages the finished bars in hops. So he completes the chocolate making process, has finished bars, puts them into containers on a bed of hops, buries them in hops, seals the container, leaves them in there for a couple of weeks. And like I mentioned, the fat content will absorb aroma, so it absorbs the aroma of the hops. Using those bars side by side is a really fun way to illustrate to folks the difference between hop bitterness and hop flavor and aroma, because you're getting two completely different aspects of them from that. There is no bitterness at all in the Nostalgia bar because there's no actual hop batter in there. You're just getting these really bright, fruity aromas from the hops. I have that one for sale down at my shop as well. I really like this method for beer in particular because I mentioned earlier, sometimes those, the beer bars, the beer character itself can get lost just a little bit behind the flavors of the chocolate. In this case, you can actually recognize the particular influence of each of these different ingredients. So another example that we can get is using ganache or fillings, and this kind of sidesteps that problem of not being able to use liquid in the process. Here, you're not incorporating the flavors of the alcohol into the chocolate itself. You're making some kind of filling and then putting chocolate around it. So that can be a caramel, a reduction, some kind of ganache, all sorts of different things. Whatever you would be able to put into a bonbon, you can figure out a way to do that with alcohol. So sometimes that's filled bars. This is Zotter Chocolate out of Austria. They do all kinds of wild flavor combinations. They make this one with champagne, but they also have ones with whiskey and other spirits. French Broad, who I just mentioned on that malted milk bar, they partner with a brewery called Burial out of Asheville. I don't believe they did it this last year, but they were every Father's Day releasing a collection of bonbon bars that were made with different beers from Burial, and not all just using dark beers like you would expect. They had an IPA bar that they were making like this very citrusy filling in the chocolate. There's one with a coffee porter. They were doing pretty high concepts rather than just like, here's one flavor combination. They were making pretty complex flavors to go with each of those. The sky's kind of the limit on this in terms of what you're allowed to do, since you don't have to worry about using the liquid in the chocolate itself. So you'll get lots of kind of unique little bonbons that will have fillings like this. In the 201 building where we're set up, we're right next to Yellowbird Chocolate out of Michigan. And they've got the owner of Yellowbird, her husband is the owner of a brewery in the same town where she makes chocolate. So they do collaborations in both directions, and she's got two different little truffles that are made with beers that he made, one with an imperial stout and one with a porter. So those are pretty fun combinations. There are, like I said earlier, combinations that you will get of different techniques like this. So there are some makers who will do soaked nibs and barrel-aged nibs to kind of give it a whole impression of that spirit. A lot of times with cocktail-inspired chocolates, you will soak the nibs in whatever the primary spirit would be for that cocktail, but then use the actual ingredients that would be typically added to that cocktail as some kind of inclusion in the bar. There's a maker in the UK that does an old-fashioned bar. So they soak the nibs in whiskey and then use candied orange peel and I can't remember what else, but to try to emulate the flavor of an old-fashioned. You'll find a lot of combinations like that as well. Jumping over to the drinks side quickly to look at how chocolate or cacao can be incorporated in those. This is far and away the most common in craft beer. People using different beer styles as sort of a platform for working with these flavors. There are fewer rules creatively in the craft beer space. You can kind of just do what you want with bringing in different flavors. There are time-honored traditions, but you have a lot more freedom to just say, hey, we're going to make a beer with coffee this week, or whatever it is you want to do. When you get to like wine or bourbon, those kind of have stricter rules around what's going to be taken seriously in those spaces. So you see this most often with craft beer. Some folks will use chocolate itself. This is not generally a great method for getting those flavors into the beer for a couple of different reasons. One is expense. If the maker has had to go through the entire process of completing chocolate, and then you're going to try to melt that chocolate into the beer, that is way more expensive than backing up that process and using the cacao itself. Additionally, melting that chocolate into the beer is going to leave a lot of fat behind and a lot of potential sludge that can settle back out of the beer. So this gets done sometimes more as a gimmick to say that you actually put chocolate in the beer. It's not a terribly efficient way to actually get the flavor of chocolate into the beer. The most common method that you're going to see is that second one, using cacao nibs themselves. So typically what a brewer would do in this case is complete the brewing process, and at the very end of that brewing process, the beer is going to cold condition for anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. And typically what they're going to do is basically do a cold infusion at that point. They'll put the cacao nibs into a mesh bag and just steep it in that conditioning tank for a few days. A few brewers will use an external filter and recirculate the beer through a filter that's packed with those cacao nibs to infuse it. That is a little bit more controllable method because then you can taste it at several points during that process and say, okay, this is exactly where we want it, and stop that recirculation. Whereas if you're just steeping the bags, it takes longer and it's a little bit harder to pinpoint, here's exactly where we want that flavor to be. There are a few companies, one big one that is making a liquid cacao nib product that some of the bigger breweries are using. I'm not going to name them because I have some concerns about how they're sourcing their cacao, but they are pretty popular in that space. More and more makers are moving to using cacao husks. So after that winnowing process, when the cacao beans get broken up into nibs and then the husk gets separated off, that husk is typically a waste product. It can just get thrown away or composted. Some people use it as mulch, but it's basically just a waste product. But it still has a pretty strong cocoa flavor to it without any of the fat that is present in the nibs. So it is cheaper because it's a waste product, and particularly with sour beer styles, which tend to be very, very dry and don't have a lot of body in them, the nibs can sometimes create a weird contrast with the kind of the richness of the nibs and this very sort of austere, dry-bodied beer. So using the husks will give the aroma of that chocolate and cocoa without leaving behind the any of that fattiness. Cocoa butter is a very rare one, but we do occasionally see it used. I mentioned Burial Beer earlier that partnered with French Broad Chocolate. They did a sour peach ale and aged it on, cold aged it on blocks of cocoa butter that had not been deodorized. A lot of the cocoa butter we get in like mass-produced white chocolate has been deodorized and it's very, very bland. Actual cocoa butter has some cocoa-like flavor to it. So they took blocks of that, put it in very, very cold beer so that it wouldn't melt and give off as much of the fat, and it just kind of infused this creamy flavor into this peach sour ale. It's really cool. We're seeing some more makers work with the actual juice and the pulp of the cacao fruit. So the beans are the seeds of this fruit, and around those seeds is fruit pulp that is really, really bright and delicious. Tastes kind of like passion fruit, lychee. Some people compare it to like lemon lime, mango. Unfortunately, it spoils very quickly, so we don't really get much of the fruit up here in North America. Cocoa Supply, who is the title sponsor of this festival and is set up over in the bank building, they are bringing in cacao nibs from Ecuador and supplying those for a lot of breweries, but they've also in the last couple of years developed a couple different products from the fruit itself. One is a pasteurized puree, one is freeze-dried fruit, and I've connected them to a couple breweries who have made beers using that as a fruit flavor rather than a chocolate flavor. If you didn't know it came from the same plant that gave you chocolate, you'd have no idea. It tastes like they infused it with some kind of tropical fruit. It requires a little bit of education on the consumer side because people have no idea what cacao is most of the time and aren't expecting that flavor, even if they do know what it is. But that is a really cool development, and I'm hoping to see more breweries go that way. One of the reasons I really like that is because kind of with the whole theme of this festival, people don't always think about the agricultural component of chocolate. Chocolate is just something that magically shows up on store shelves, and you don't think about the fact that there's farmers and farm workers and this agricultural component. Being able to highlight that this is a fruit and being able to taste the fruit flavors kind of brings that one step closer to realizing, okay, this actually had to be grown somewhere. So I really like breweries working with that. And then finally, as a garnish, we're seeing this in the mixology spaces of some creative mixologists who are working with, they work with these different ingredients to infuse flavor, but then using completed craft chocolate as some kind of garnish. There is a mixologist named Michael George who won a national cocktail contest 2 years back, who had formerly worked at Ritual Chocolate, who I talked about earlier. And they used some of Ritual's chocolate as a garnish on one of their winning cocktails. So we're starting to see more places do that as well. There are a handful, I know I've talked about beer here, there are a handful of distilleries who have done infused whiskeys of some kind with cacao nibs usually. It's just not all that common. So you might run into it, but it's not a huge thing yet. I want to look at one case study real quick where we're seeing some really neat creative overlap between brewing and chocolate making. Aeronaut Brewing is up in Somerville, Massachusetts. It's a western suburb of Boston. In their building, they lease out space to Somerville Chocolate, who is a craft chocolate maker, and that proximity has allowed for a lot of creative exchange between both of those. So they make a range of bars, and then the brewery makes a range of beers, being able to use those. And what's cool is you end up getting this exchange of ingredients that can kind of loop back on itself. So let's look at this example here. So these beer-soaked chocolates, this was a recent project that they did just in the last year. The brewery made a beer style called Baltic Porter, which is a strong, dark style. Doesn't have the intensity of an imperial stout, but has some similar flavors to it. And after they completed that process, they took a portion of that beer and split it into 2 rye whiskey barrels and aged it in these barrels. Then the chocolate maker gave them 2 different cacao nibs. One was a dark roasted Ecuadorian cacao, and then one was a very light roast of that same cacao variety. They put those 2 different cacaos into the barrels. The light roasted cacao they also put vanilla into. Then after that had conditioned for a bit, they took those ingredients back out and gave them back to the chocolate maker, and he made 2 different bars, one with the dark roast, one with the light roast and the vanilla that had come back out of the barrel. Then the brewery released those 2 beers, and he released the 2 bars, and you could taste all of them together and see how those different flavors were overlapping. I didn't get to taste the beer, but I did taste the 2 bars, and they were just absolutely beautiful and very, very different from each other to kind of highlight how those subtle differences would create more distinction in the finished product. That hops dark milk down there at the end is made very similar to the Nostalgia hop-aged bar that I talked about earlier. He ages that with hops that he gets right from the brewers across the hall and then releases that. And it's got this beautiful hoppy character, but none of the bitterness since he's not using the hops themselves in there. He's got another bar that is made with nibs that the brewery has infused during the primary fermentation of the beer. And then they give those back to him, and then they release the chocolate beer, and he releases that bar side by side. So really cool creative opportunities between those. That is a bunch of examples to go through here. Does anybody have any questions about any of these as we wrap up? Yes?
Can you talk again just a little bit about the malted milk bar?
Yeah, sure. So that one was made with malt powder. Malt is a type of barley that has been prepared for the brewing process so that the starches in it will be able to be turned into fermentable sugars for the yeast to ferment. They take some of that malt from a local malt house and grind it into a powder and then infuse that into the bar, just mix it into the chocolate itself. So you get some of that sweetness from the malt. If you ever had malted milk balls or malt milkshakes or something like that, you're familiar with that sort of gentle, sweet flavor. So they put that into the bar itself. They don't really go out of their way to advertise that it's got that beer connection. They mention the malt house on the back of the package, but if you didn't know that that was a beer ingredient, it's just kind of a delicious bar. You know, it's got that sweetness from the malt. But if you know that connection, then it's a cool connection to the brewing community. There's a lot of breweries, including some, I don't know any right here locally, but in the Midwest who work with that same malt from that malt house. So cool connection to that. All right, so I mentioned I work with both craft chocolate and craft beverages professionally. The company I run is Bean-to-Barstool. We have a podcast and a website and a small publishing house as well that puts out, I've got a book on pairing beer and chocolate and some different zines and things like that. So you can check those out. I am leading a ticketed pairing this afternoon. Tickets are still available. I found out this morning there was a small issue with the ticketing website that the festival was using. So if you didn't get tickets to that and were trying to, at the library where they're doing registration, they are handling that in person if you want to check those out. I've got a sign-up sheet up here for our newsletter if you're interested. Obviously don't have to. And if you didn't already grab a sticker from our booth, you can grab a sticker for Bean-to-Barstool as well. I've got books on pairing beer and chocolate. This is my book that I published earlier this year. We are selling these over at the booth in the bank building if you're interested. Otherwise, are there any last questions as we wrap up? All right, thank you all so much for giving me your attention. Hope you learned a few things and found some new bars to check out. Thank you.